be online with you guys. We've got over 600 fellow tree huggers out there, and what could be better than spending a Tuesday night with you? I'm really thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker, Jim McGlone. He has a PhD in human ecology, also known as economics. He can explain that to us. From Virginia Tech, and a master's certificate in environmental law and policy from the USDA Graduate School. He has taught economics at Virginia Tech, Ohio State, and Northern Illinois University. I will say all football powerhouses, and has done research at the Economic Research Service of USDA. He's a self-taught naturalist and ecologist. He's managed the natural resources of a 500-acre park in Fairfax County, and he's currently an urban forest conservationist with the Virginia Department of Forestry in Northern Virginia. He and his wife have been practicing conservation landscaping since 2005 and eliminated turf grass from their property in 2008. So without further ado, I turn the mic and the screen over to Jim.
Well, thank you, Ann. There we go. Can everybody see my screen? Ann?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. It's always nice when the technology works. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you all for welcoming me into your computer or other device to spend the evening talking about trees. Title of my talk is How to Build a Forest in Your Front Yard. And when Virginia Whitmer asked me to do this presentation, one of the tasks she gave me was to be inspirational. So here's my inspiration and my bona fides. This is my front yard 50 weeks ago, so mid-October. And as was mentioned in the introduction, we don't have any turf grass either in the front or the back. And my wife and I have been building this for at least 15 years. And so I know a little bit about front yard forests. I also know a little bit about forestry and arboriculture. Before we get into all of this thing, I want to address the question that comes up every time, which is cultivars. I was recently participated in a conference, and one of the speakers was trying to argue that we don't need native plants to support our native wildlife. And I thought about how I would go about rebutting that statement. And as I was thinking about that, I realized that instead of thinking of plants as monolithic things, we need to think about them as systems of tissues, just the way human beings are a system of tissues, hearts and lungs and livers and all of that. Well, plants are the same way. So they have flowers and stems and leaves and fruit and roots, and these all interact with other parts of the ecosystem and other organisms in the ecosystem in different ways. So when we say native plants support native wildlife, what we mean is native plants have these multifaceted, complex relationships with varied parts of the ecosystem, and provide provide functions for those different parts individually as well as together as a unit. And this is why people keep asking, what about using cultivars? And the answer keeps coming up to being that very unsatisfactory, it depends. And this is why it's so unsatisfactory. Not only is the relationship between a plant and the ecosystem very complex and multifaceted, the whole genre of cultivars is extremely complex, from things like autumn glory, red maple, which all derive from a wild pollinated seed, to the apples and pears and things that we have been selectively breeding for 2,500 years. So it becomes really complicated, and that's why we keep coming up with it depends. On the handout, I gave you a couple of tips for evaluating cultivars and trying to determine whether or not it's a plant that you want to use in your landscape. The other thing about this model is I realized it also affects native plant species selection. Most of the speakers and a lot of people I hear talking about why we need native plants is we need the native plants to grow the caterpillars, to grow the baby birds. And that is an important and compelling story that we should be telling. But then they go on to say, if you're only going to plant one native plant, plant an oak. And that's also fine. But when you think about how the different tissues of the oak interact with different parts of the ecosystem, oaks don't do much of anything for bees. And once they get big enough, they don't even feed deer except for their fruit. And there aren't that many birds that rely on oaks for food. So it's really focusing on that story of the leaf to the caterpillar to the baby bird. And that's what a lot of the speakers have been focusing on. And I want to change that focus tonight. And I'm going to talk more about particularly flowers and bees and fruit and birds, particularly berries, because it's berry season. So why would you want to build a forest in your front yard? And most of this has probably been covered already, but I'm going to go over it again. We know when we replace turf with native plants, we get an increase in insect and bird diversity. We don't necessarily get an increase either in diversity or numbers of mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And that's an important point because I've been talking about this for 15 years, and the pushback that we get, that I always get, is snakes and rats. And it doesn't help to explain the ecology of snakes and rats and point out that it's not snakes and rats, it's snakes or rats, because people don't want them living in their basement. So unless there is habitat nearby that they can walk, crawl, slither, hop, however they traverse it, to get to your new habitat, they're not going to show up. And if they do show up and you are creating good habitat for them, they're going to stay in that good habitat instead of moving into your basement. And those are important points to make with people because they do tend to not like things that walk, crawl, hop, slither, but they do like things that fly, like birds and butterflies and bees. And so those are the things that will find your isolated habitat more easily than the things that have to walk there to get there. But to get these diversities, you do need vertical, horizontal, temporal, native plant diversity, and we'll talk more about that later. We also see increases in human health and well-being. We see reduced management of the landscape, which means we get volunteer plants and we get more time to enjoy them. Because after all, this is not just habitat for all the other critters, it's also our habitat. We improve the soil, we get better stormwater management with less runoff, we get improved with more carbon sequestration, and for the homeowner, it can result in reduced utility bills because we're increasing transpiration, which is going to cool slightly anyway, your local environment. Now, the importance of some of these things is when you start talking about human health and well-being, stormwater management, and carbon sequestration, these are big policy concerns of most governments. And there is a big push from most local governments to expand their urban or community canopy, but that can only happen on private property because in most cases, the government only owns about 10% of the land base, if that much. But to get that expansion and get people to plant, and this is why we're talking about front yard forest, you need to do it in your front yard because that's going to help break that turf first landscaping paradigm. If you do this stuff in your backyard, you get all those benefits. But if nobody can see it, you're not going to be eroding this idea that we should have turf as our first line of defense when we do landscaping. And this is something that Doug Tolomei and Janet Davis and many of the other speakers have talked about. But you have to have the courage to buck the social norm and do this out front where everybody can see it. So how do we go about doing this? Well, it's actually not that hard to build a forest in your front yard or your backyard or your side yard or any place else. What you need are diverse layers of native plants. Throughout the course of this webinar series, we have talked a lot about what native plants means. I prefer to focus on the ecosystem function through generally achieved through coevolution, but there can be other discussions. So I'm not going to get too deeply into that. As far as the forest is concerned, not that complicated. There are generally 4 layers of a deciduous, hardwood, temperate forest. There's the ground layer, the shrub layer, the understory, and the canopy. The canopy, of course, are the big trees, so that's from about 60 feet up. The understory are the smaller trees. That goes from about 25 feet to 60 feet. The shrub layer goes from about 1 foot to 25 feet, and the ground layer is about 1 foot, but it can extend up into that shrub layer if we're talking about tall herbaceous plants. And of course, within each of those layers, there are young specimens of species from the upper layers. In terms of the forest, though, the shrub and ground layer are particularly important for our native birds, not because they produce a lot of caterpillars, but because that's where most of our native birds nest. About 75% of our woodland songbirds nest within 15 feet of the ground. So it doesn't do us a lot of good to provide a whole lot of caterpillars for the young if we're not also providing nesting habitat. The diversity is the layer. The vertical diversity is those layers that I just talked about, but we also want horizontal diversity, which is diversity within the layers. Now, if we're talking about a situation like mine, which I live on I have a less than a quarter-acre lot in suburbia, I don't have room for a whole lot of big trees. So that horizontal diversity does not necessarily have to take place on my property. It could also be taking place on the properties around me. So if you're thinking about planting a canopy tree and you're trying to get that horizontal diversity with the canopy, look and see what your neighbors have in their yard or what's growing around you. So you might look at your neighbors and see red maple, willow oak, red maple, pin oak, red maple, river birch, red maple, sycamore. As you may have guessed from what I just said, we got a lot of red maple out there. And red maple is an important plant to provide early season nectar and pollen for our early generalist bees, but that box is checked. So you might think about planting something else unless you live in a really unusual neighborhood that doesn't already have a lot of red maple. The temporal diversity is where we get peak ecological values at different times from different kinds of plants. Typically, the people are talking about bloom time, and I will talk about bloom time, but also think about when berries ripen. The speaker 2 weeks ago mentioned that the berries on winterberry holly become food in late December and early January, whereas possum haw doesn't become food until late January and into mid-February. So they are ripening or they're being used as resources at different times. So you need to think about that as well when we start talking about temporal diversity. And I've got one other element of temporal diversity that I'll save for later. So you're going to use native plants. You're going to plant them in layers. So you're going to have some large trees, small trees, lots of shrubs, lots of herbaceous plants, but you still have to consider the right tree and right place. This is the mantra of arboriculture. And what this means is you want a tree that will grow in your yard. So you want to make sure you have room for the roots of the tree that you're planting. The general rule is 1.5 foot radius per inch diameter, 4.5 feet above ground. And that's 1.5 foot radius of the critical root zone. So a 10-inch diameter tree has a 15-foot radius or a 30-foot diameter root system under it. Needless to say, as trees get bigger, they need more space for their roots. And this is one thing most people don't think about is there room for their roots? The other question is there room for the crown? So you want to look up and make sure you're not planning to plant an oak right under a 3-phase power line that everybody in your neighborhood depends on. Because if you do, the power company is going to come and properly prune that tree to look really strange as they prevent it from causing the power to go out. Another consideration is, will the tree grow here? So we want to think about climate. For most of Virginia, spruce and firs are not going to do well in this climate. I frequently get questions. My Colorado spruce is not doing well, and my first statement is that's because it's not in Colorado where it belongs. It's part of the reason for using those native plants. But you also need to consider a little bit about soil type. And one of the previous speakers from the spring mentioned the natural communities from DCR. By the way, that handout also has all of these websites on it, so you don't need to be trying to scribble these down. One of the things that's interesting, if you read those natural plant community descriptions, is they always start off with the soil type. And one of the things people don't understand about how plants, trees in particular, distribute themselves across the landscape is they think they're growing where they're getting some resource that they need. And actually, it's more accurate to say they are growing where they can stand the site stress better than other plants or other trees. So this is a bald cypress growing in standing water. It's very stressful on a tree to have the soil saturated because there's no oxygen for the root system. Bald cypresses grow in standing water because they can, and very few other trees can as well. So this is a way of eliminating competition for the site. Similarly, we have dryland oaks that tend to grow on very dry or infertile soils. Things like chestnut oak, white oak, post oak, black, northern and southern red oak, scarlet oaks. They are all found on these pretty crappy sites. And the good thing about that is, in my experience, there aren't too many non-native invasive species that will grow there as well. So you can look at this. And the other thing I wanted to make, point I wanted to make is these natural communities, excuse me, have more of a geological affinity, meaning that they all grow there together because they have gotten used to, or they've learned how to deal with the stresses of that site, rather than there being a strong biological affinity. So even if it says you should be planting oak heath, there are other plants that may be able to grow in those conditions if they don't have to compete with other plants. So there is some room to move those things around. And sometimes Mother Nature makes suggestions. So this bright red tree, or large shrub, small tree, is, and it's not just the closed captioning that has problems with botanical names. This is Rus copalinum, I think it is. It's the winged sumac. Volunteered in my yard, and whatever bird planted it there chose a good site. I liked it, so we have let it grow. It gets a little bigger than I thought it did, but it's a medium-sized, as I said, a large shrub, small tree. And sumac is one of the underused plants in our landscapes, I think. It's a 3-season plant, so you can see it's got great fall color, but it also has really good growing season interest. I will admit, in the winter, it looks like crap, but it's got these great dark green foliage. This is actually Rus glabra, the smooth sumac. This is a smaller species than the shining or the wing sumac, but those bright red berries that started off as white creamy flowers, great for a great generalist plant for pollinators, also a great bird plant. So this is a plant that has peak ecological value at 2 different times during the year because of the pollinators and the birds. It's got a reputation for spreading and being hard to control, which my wife and I found was actually not the case. We just treated the root suckers as weeds. When they came up where we didn't want them, we just picked them like weeds in the spring. And of course, that's Pycnanthium in the foreground, another great pollinator plant. But sometimes Mother Nature makes suggestions that we don't particularly like. My wife complained that our gray dogwood was crowding the red buckeye. And since I don't let her touch the pruners, I was sent out to do something about it. And when I did, I discovered that in the middle of this dense stand of gray dogwood, there was a wing burning bush growing. And I treated it. And then 2 weeks later, I thought, oh, I could have used that as for this presentation. And by the time I got out there to take the picture, not so great. This is used in the landscape trade because it's got great red color in the fall. I don't think it can really compete with the sumacs or the Itea virginiana, the Virginia sweet spire. And when I was putting this slide together, I noticed a bonus down here in the lower left corner. Those notches are from leafcutter bees. So when we talk about bee habitat, it's about more than just flowers with pollen and nectar. We also need to be supporting their nesting requirements, and leafcutter bees need leaves, obviously. Now, previous speakers have gone through ad nauseum. Well, I won't say ad nauseum, but they've been showing you great pictures of lots of different plants. And since I was given a dual mandate, I'm going to just show you a few. Here are some examples of ground cover, Antennaria, plantain leaf pussy toes. I haven't trained my tongue for all of these things. This is a great plant that grows in a lot of conditions. It's an evergreen. Antennaria is moderately large genus, so there are representatives throughout. I'm pretty sure this one is native to every county in Virginia. If it's not native to your county, there is certainly one that is. You can look on the digital atlas to find out, the digital atlas of the flora of Virginia. Again, that's also on the handout, and check and see if it's native to your particular county. Virginia strawberry is another badly underused ground cover. It spreads well. It's native to every county in Virginia. I do remember checking on that. It's also a host plant for a native bee that only pollinates these plants. It's also good for generalist bees. So don't think you're only supporting one bee with this plant. You're supporting a lot of them. And then, of course, it produces berries for birds and other wildlife. I'm pretty sure the box turtles eat these things because it's low growing. So it makes it a great substitute for English ivy. And both of these plants you can put in either your forest habitat or in more of a meadow habitat because they grow along the ground. They're fairly shade tolerant and they'll just grow under everything else. Another underappreciated ground cover is violets, and there are a couple of specialist bees for violets as well. And the great thing about violets is you usually don't have to buy them or plant them. They just let them come. They'll show up. In the shrub layers, here are a couple of examples. Viburnum prunifolium on the left, Itea virginiana in the middle, Plethoralnifolia on the right. That's black haw, sweet spire, and meadow sweet. This not only represents horizontal diversity, but also temporal diversity, because the black haw, that picture I took on April 25th. So it's an early spring plant. Itea virginiana, the sweet spire, is a late spring plant, and meadowsweet is a summer plant. And notice the Itea virginiana is growing in a pot. That's because it doesn't really belong in my yard. I planted it in the yard a couple of times and it died very quickly despite my best efforts. Janet Davis, who was the second speaker, hooked me up with, I think this is called Little Henry. It's a dwarf cultivar. I really like this plant. And as I said, we are sharing this habitat. So this is a plant for me rather than necessarily a plant for the birds and the bees. Some other shrubs that you might want to include in your landscape if you've got the right soils. Upper left is a native azalea. Again, that's for me because I like that orange flame azalea, even though I live in Fairfax and it's not native there. The plant next to it is the native pinkster bloom azalea from Fairfax. For those of you who live in the Southwest, that's where the flame azalea is native to. This in the upper right is a blueberry. I think it's Vaccinium eliade, but I'm not positive. Those things are really hard to identify in the field beyond it's a vaccinium. And even that can be tricky, as I'll mention in a minute. Lower right is gray dogwood. Notice the white berries. We do have specialist bees that only do the shrub dogwoods, the ones with the small bracts. They do not like the dogwoods, the tree dogwoods with the big bracts. And then huckleberry in the lower right or lower left. All three of these, or all four of these plants support specialist bees. And we go to the understory where we have small trees. On the left is Cornus florida, the flowering dogwood, and on the right is Cirsus canadensis, redbud. And this is an example of those stories we can tell with these things. There are only generalist bees that use Cornus florida. There is a specialist bee that specializes on Cirsus canadensis. The leaf cutter bees will use Cornus florida, but they really, really like the redbud leaves for their nests. But this time of year, Cornus florida comes into its own because of those red berries are probably a better food resource than those dry, almost dead looking seed pods from the Cirsus canadensis. So we tell those different stories about the relationship between these plants and native wildlife at different times of the year, and they have different points where they are the most ecologically beneficial. The other thing I want to point out is the picture on the left of the dogwood was taken in, I think, 2007, possibly 2008. This is what that hillside looks like in probably 2017 or 18. I know it was after we had the deck fixed. It's also a little later in the season because the flowers on the dogwood are almost gone. But you can see there was a big difference in the amount of vegetation on that hillside. And the point here is that this is not something that you have to do all at once. It is a process, and especially for those of you who are gardeners like my mom, and there's something about just being out there and messing with the plants that really does it for you. This is something that can take place. This is a process that can take place over time. And then there's the canopy trees. This is a Quercus alba. I think it's the Fairfax County champion Quercus alba. If you've got a big tree like this in your yard, you're already got a big leg up because you don't have to wait 100 years for the tree to get that big. You can start working on it, and actually it would be good for this tree and most of our trees to do this kind of planting underneath them, where we're going to be introducing green mulch in place of turf, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. And then we can also include vines. This is Lanisterus sempervirens, our native coral honeysuckle. This is what it looked like in April. It is still blooming in my yard, not as profusely, but it's still out there. This is a great plant for hummingbirds, but it's also a great plant for hummingbird moths because it not only provides the nectar resources for the adults, it's a host plant for their caterpillars. So that's got it. Those are good things, but vines can create both vertical and horizontal diversity at the same time. Now, I mentioned the bees, and I mentioned several of these plants. If you go to this website, and again, it's on the handout, there's a lot of information about specialist bees from along the coast from, I think he goes as far north as New Jersey, down to Florida and around to, I think, Alabama and Mississippi are included. But what he found was that most of our specialized bees specialize on either early season plants. These are things that bloom in March. So we're talking about the willows and also spring ephemerals, or late season plants like asters and goldenrod that are just the asters and goldenrods that are just starting to bloom. And another twist on temporal diversity, there are bees that specialize on Oenotheria, which is evening primrose. These are flowers that open at the end of the day, and these bees only come out at the end of the day. So this is a critical resource for them. In other terms, they tend to be specialized on dominant species. So this would be a species that covers a large area and provides a lot of resources to at that in an area. Also with unusual flower shapes. So we have about 5 species of bees that only do vacciniums, but not deerberry and huckleberry, because they have those bell-shaped flowers. And there are a couple of families, the Astraceas, especially starting now. We have bees that come out and they use all of the asters that bloom really late in the season, as well as some of the Ericaceas, which would be the heath plants, which would include the blueberries and the blackberries. And just an example of that, when we think about goldenrod, again, this is temporal diversity. There are lots of goldenrods. I think most of the goldenrod in our yard volunteer. By the way, goldenrod does not cause hay fever. That's the nasty ragweed that does and blooms at the same time. I took this picture in August, and you can see there are some goldenrods that are in bloom at that time. This morning, I went specifically and looked at them, and they're all done. But in that box are more goldenrods that have just started to bloom. And by just, I mean, this morning I looked at them and they were nicely bloomed. And so we're going to get different cohorts of bees that are going to use these. And we have some bees that will specialize on only one or a few species of goldenrod that bloom at the same time. Another thing to consider is fruit diversity. So these are 3 common viburnums, Prunifolium, dentatum, and acerifolium. One of the things that distinguishes them is they all bloom at different times. These pictures were all taken on April 25th. But the other thing is the black haw, as you'll see in a minute, had very big berries, whereas dentatum, the arrowwoods, have smaller berries, but those berries are still bigger than the maple leaf. So they are going to be feeding different groups of birds based on their size. So there are going to be some birds that'll feed on the maple leaf that are too small to eat those black haw berries. By the way, if you want to grow viburnums for your own use, I would recommend the Prunifolium. So here are some berries from my yard. Again, dogwood in the upper left, upper right, these are the black hawberries. By the way, viburnums are self-incompatible. So if you're going to plant viburnums, go to 2 different sources for them so that they will cross-pollinate. They're not male and female only, but they don't like to date themselves. And black gum have these nice purple berries. I noticed in some of the guides, they made reference to Tupelo honey. It's not from Nyssa sylvatica, which is what we have here in Virginia. It's from Nyssa. Tupelo honey is from Nyssa ogochi in the Mississippi Delta and the Gulf coastal plains. And then this is one of my favorite plants. This is Aurelia spinosa, better known as devil's walking stick. You are never, ever, ever going to find this in the commercial trade. This was a rescue plant, but I'm circling here on the what was the flower head and is now the berry head. This is about half again. Well, it's probably about twice the size of a basketball. And they produce little tiny flowers, which are great for our later season, late summer, small native bee pollinators, but they also produce these blue blackberries that come ripe early in the season and are great for the birds. So this is another 2-interest plant. One of the things that's critically important, Ptolemy talks a lot about how the caterpillars and the leaves have learned to get along. Well, our native North American berries typically have a 30 to 50% fat content, whereas the Eurasian berries, the non-native ones, are usually less than 1%. Fat is very important for birds, for our resident birds, in getting through the winter, but also for the neotropical migrants that have to fly to South America, because it takes a lot of energy to cross the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And I've been talking to wildlife biologists for over a decade who keep talking about those neotropical migrant birds that feed on those Eurasian berries, and they don't make it to South America. The last element is what foresters call coarse woody debris. That can be logs down. This is a rescue log. We picked this up at a plant rescue. My wife thought it looked pretty with all this false turkey tail fungus on it, so we brought it to the yard. But it can also be wood chips. And I will tell you, the research on mulch has found that wood chips, especially green wood chips that you can get, this picture implies, free from a lot of arborists, are the best mulch you can use. In fact, over at the USGS Bee Lab, and this gets to how do you get started, they're converting really crappy power line habitat that's full of nasty stuff, invasives, non-natives, to good native plant habitat by starting off with a 12-inch layer of wood chips. They're not using cardboard, they're not using newspaper, they're not using landscape fabric, they're not using plastic. All of those things create water and vapor barriers that not only kill the plants, they also kill your soil ecosystem. 12 inches of wood chips after you mow is going to be too deep for any of those weeds to get up through before they exhaust their carbohydrate resources in their seeds. And as they decompose, they're going to improve your soil quality. One other use for wood chips is to create pathways. I know Doug Ptolemy showed you pictures of his yard where he's got mowed grass. We have mulch. And mulch is critically important because it is an essential habitat element for ectomycorrhizal fungi, which are the important fungi that form symbiotic relationships with woody plants and help them gather water and nutrients. So we do need to have some in our landscape. All right, so that's selecting the trees to put in your forest. Now it's time to go to the nursery and buy some stuff to plant. So one of the things I want you to be aware of is we get 5 times more tree root mass under mulch than under turf. And by mulch, we mean both brown and green mulch. So it's okay to plant as long as it's not turf that you're planting under these trees. So if you start with a big tree that's already in place and you want to start building that forest underneath, that is good for that tree because you're getting rid of that turf that is competing with the tree roots, and you're creating a better habitat for those tree roots. However, if you are going to start planting stuff under this big tree, one of the considerations is you don't want to start digging great big holes in the root system of this tree. First of all, it's going to be hard to do it, but second of all, it's not going to be good for the root system. So you want to plant small. And as it turns out, whether or not you have a big tree to start with, all of the research at the universities is showing that when you start with small size nursery stock, and I'm talking about 1.5-inch caliper that's measured, that caliper is the diameter 6 inches above ground, 1.5-inch caliper or less, you wind up with a better plant in the long run. It's also easier to plant. It establishes faster. It's going to get that drought or flood tolerance that you want from that plant if you're planting for that sooner, because they will not become drought or flood tolerant until they're established. They're also cheaper, and what we're finding is they are better suited for compacted or poorly drained soils, which is very typical of suburbia. The only downside, if you look at this chart, is you do have to do more of the pruning. And that is a very minor downside, because when they're being pruned at the growers, you can see right here above my thumb, that is a pruning cut. That's a heading cut that was made by the grower to shape this plant so it's a shrub, so it should have kind of like a ball shape or, you know, an egg shape. And they were pruning it so that it would look nice and sell faster, not necessarily the kind of pruning you really want to be doing on your plants to get good structure. So to me, it's not really much of a downside that I have to prune the plants instead of the grower. Another consideration is irrigation. When you buy a plant, and this is a realistic chart for watering your new planting. You plant on a 1.5-inch or a 2-inch or smaller caliper tree on a Saturday. If it's less than 2 inches, you're going to water it daily for 6 weeks. And that's 1 gallon per inch caliper. And you water every other day until it's established. And it takes a year for the plant to establish. So you are committing to a lot of supplemental irrigation. And it doesn't matter whether it's balled and burlapped or container grown. Balled and burlap trees are losing a lot of their root system when they are dug. Container grown trees have a lot of absorbing roots, and I'll talk more about that, but the way they're grown, they've got a lot more top that the root system can support. So both of them are going to need that supplemental watering. Now, I know one of the concerns is, well, we want something that's going to be big and make. So a couple of weeks ago, in an effort to practice what I've been preaching about willows, my wife and I went out and we purchased a couple of Salix sericias. These are silky willows that we were going to plant in our yard. That's me standing behind them. I'm 6 feet tall, and you can see this one plant on the side reaches all the way up to here, is easily 10 feet tall. This one is not so tall, but it's a bit bushier. And this is a 3/4 inch wide tape measure. So you can see this is less than 1 inch caliper tree. So we're not necessarily talking about really tiny plants, although I do recommend seedlings. Actually, I recommend seeds if you can pull it off. So we're talking about, you want to go with smaller stock, but you want to be careful about it. Now, when we bought these trees, we went through the order online, pick it up at the curb. So we got what the nursery put out for us. When I got home, the first thing I noticed as we were taking the trees out of the car is this root sticking out of the weep hole. Typically, that is a bad sign, and I generally recommend you do not buy trees that have roots sticking out of a weep hole, because that's usually a sign that plant has been in that pot for a long time. One of the other things to look for is whether there are weeds growing there. Now, if I had seen that before I selected that plant and paid for it, I would have pulled it out of the container to look at the root system, because I expected it was going to be root bound. And before I did that, I sent my wife to get the camera so we could take lots of pictures so that I could share them with you. I was really surprised when I pulled it out of the container. This is what it looked like. This is the root that was sticking out, but I expected there would be a lot of circling roots and everything. Now, a root like this is still part of the absorbing root system. Trees are constantly growing and shedding those roots, so I don't worry too much about those. They're going to go away as soon as whatever that tree was looking for absorbed, or whatever attracted it is absorbed. What I do find, and as I started looking at it more closely, I noticed on the bottom, this root. This is a permanent root, and it's growing in a really funky way, and the tree is never going to fix that once you get it in the ground. So I wanted to see what was going on with the root system of this tree, and also notice I didn't do this. This just happened as I pulled it out. So the root ball was already starting to come apart, which is not a bad thing. And I decided to bare root this tree. And these are my bare rooting tools. So I have my 5-gallon bucket, some handcrafted, finely made mulch. This is not available to anybody except me, and water. My wife makes this mulch by hand. The idea is, once I get the soil, the growing medium off of the root system, I knew it was going to be a while before I could get it in the ground. So I put it in the 5-gallon bucket, dumped the mulch in on top, put water on it to keep that root system moist. So this is what it started as. This is what I finally wound up planting. One of the advantages to doing this is, when you do this, you can expose all of the roots and all of the root problems. Now, that root that was growing along the bottom, I was able to easily straighten that one out. But this root right here, I tried and tried, I couldn't straighten it out. It was going to grow this way. It was going to grow back into the root system. It was going to start to circle and cause problems. So what do you do with that? Well, I grabbed my pruners and I cut it off before the kink. So now that root is growing straight out of the root ball. One of the other things I found with the other plant is my finger is right there where the root plate is, or the root flare or trunk flare. This is essentially the spot where the tree stops being trunk and becomes root system. And you can see there are several adventitious roots that are growing up here. This is why volcano mulching is bad, although it usually goes much higher on the trees. You get these poorly attached roots that are growing out of part of the trunk. And you can see on this bamboo stick back here, this is about where the soil level was. So this was planted too deep in the root ball. And when you are looking at plants in the nursery, I recommend you take a skewer or something and start probing around, try and figure out where that first major root is, because that's where your root plate is, and see how deep it is in the ball. I have seen them sometimes 10 inches deep. And that plant, we planted it, it was a red maple when we planted it. When I came back and looked at it a year later, it was a little leaf linden. And that's not some magic, it's just the red maple died and they replaced it with a little leaf linden. So you can see those problems when you bare root and correct. Now, Sometimes you wind up with a root ball that looks like this. This is a plant from the same nursery that we bought back in April. And I pulled it out. My original intention was to bare root this, but there is such a dense root mat that I couldn't bare root it. Now, as I said, I don't worry too much about these small roots out here, but these are problems. These are going in the wrong direction. There were several others. And the way you deal with this, and this is the horror part of the show, is I took out my bow saw. I had already determined I needed a new blade for it. And I didn't butterfly it. I didn't make slices in it. I took the bow saw and I cut off the outer 1.5 inches of that root ball. And this is what it looked like before we planted it. Now, I will point out to you, remember I said these container grown trees tend to have a lot of absorbing roots, so they're absorbing water. This thing needed a lot of irrigation this summer, even though we had a reasonable amount of rain, largely because it had so many absorbing roots that it was drying out that root ball really fast. Hopefully next year it will put out more roots, it'll be reaching out more, and we won't have as much problem with that. But this is the university research that shows this is the way to deal with root balls that look like the one on the left. Now, when you get ready to put these things in the ground, there are two things that you really have to pay attention to. First of all, that root collar that I pointed out, where it stops being trunk and becomes root, should be at existing grade. Some people I know say, well, plant a little high for drainage. That's crap. You don't do that. You want that root collar at the existing grade. The other thing is nothing goes in the planting hole but the tree, water, and the soil that came out. I know I can hear you out there saying, but I have this really crappy clay soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't matter. When you start amending that backfill soil, you create a hydrological discontinuity. And that means it makes it really hard for water to either go into the planting hole or leave the planting hole. Because water does not like to cross barriers from one type of soil to another type of soil. So don't amend it. If you amend it, you're going to be turning your planting hole into a pot, essentially. So the first thing you want to do is expose the top of that root flare and remove any of that excess soil or actually growing medium for the container trees, because it's not really soil in those pots. Down to that root flare. Once you have done that, you want to dig a hole that's the depth of that modified root ball. This is one of the other advantages to the bare rooting, because you might have noticed the root ball that for those willows went from being about maybe 15 inches to being more like 6 inches, which means I don't have to dig as deep a hole. I did have to dig a wider hole, because now I'm going to be spreading those roots out to a greater extent. You want to make a pedestal. That means once you get your hole dug to the right depth, you go around the outside and you dig up some more. You also, and I didn't put this in the slide, you also want to rough up the edges of the hole. Most of the time, you're going to be digging in subsoil, which has a high clay content. And when you do that, as your shovel goes through, it can glaze the side of the hole and make it hard for water and for roots to penetrate. So if you rough up the side of the hole, that will make it easier for those things to do. The reason for the pedestal is it gives the plant a little more broken up, uncompacted soil to deal with, but you do want the plant on undisturbed soil, because if you've got disturbed soil underneath it, that can compact and settle. And just like you don't want your house foundation to settle, you don't want the foundation of your tree to settle. Take all the ropes, the wire basket, and the burlap, or the container if it's container grown. I know there is a big debate, and the science right now does not support one side or the other about whether you can leave some of the basket and the burlap in the hole. One of the things about that debate is nobody is saying that it benefits the plant to leave the basket and the burlap in the hole. That is all about maintaining the integrity of the root ball. And as you have already seen tonight, I don't hold with that. So that's packing material. Leaving that stuff in the hole to me is like leaving the styrofoam around your TV after you mount it on the wall. It doesn't belong there. It makes things more complicated. You want to put the tree in the hole, plumb it with the root flare at soil level. One of the tricks there is lay your shovel, especially if you're using a long handled shovel like Smokey does, lay your shovel down across the hole and use that as your level to estimate where grade is. Refill the hole. You want to tamp it lightly because you want to get rid of any large air pockets, but you don't want to stomp on it to the point of compacting that soil. If you have a hose handy, you can use the hose to kind of turn that backfill into a slurry and help us settle it in the hole. Again, nothing goes in the hole but the soil that came out of it, water, and the tree you're planting. At the time of planting, if you've got dead branches or broken branches, prune them off. Otherwise, do not prune the tree. Do not cut off any branches, regardless of your structural issues, until the tree, don't do the structural pruning until the tree is established. So that could be a year or 2 years, or if you go with much bigger trees, even 3 or 4 years down the road. It doesn't have to be done at the time of planting, and the tree needs the energy produced by those branches. And of course, remove all your tags. I did a tree planting demonstration, and the nursery that donated the trees put these cardboard sticky things around the trunk of the tree to protect the bark during transit. And I was telling people they needed to remove that because it creates a habitat for fungus. And sure enough, there was fungus under the wraps. I really like it when the trees work with me and make me look good. Water well, mulch 3 to 4 inches deep with arborist chips. People ask me how far to mulch your trees, and I always tell them mulch to the property line. The only thing we know about mulch is the wider your mulch circle, the better it is for the tree. I don't think anybody's done run the numbers to find out where that optimal break point is. If you can't get arborist chips, go with single shredded hardwood. Bark is waxy and is designed to keep water in the trunk of the tree, which also means that it keeps water out of the trunk of the tree, so it doesn't absorb water, it floats. The finely shredded mulches will lock together and again create a vapor and water barrier, which is the exact opposite of what you want to do with your mulch. And cardboard, paper, I already talked about that. That stuff will kill your soils, so don't use that. Now, I want to say something about fertilizer. Trees use their carbon-nitrogen ratio to determine where to grow. And by that, I mean where to put their growth efforts, whether to grow tops or bottom, whether to grow canopy or roots. When the carbon-nitrogen ratio is high, they grow roots because the plant says, I've got lots of energy, but I don't have anything to work on. When the carbon-nitrogen ratio is low, it grows tops, but not roots because it says, because the plant interprets that as I've got lots of raw material, but I don't have enough energy to use it all. In the nurseries, the plants, especially the containerized plants, are getting a lot of nitrogen, so they'll grow tops so they can sell faster. And in some cases, that leads to what I call plant bondage. You look at the picture here, you can see this bamboo stake and these really tight blue ties. Those are there because this plant doesn't stand up well on its own. because it's gotten so much nitrogen and grown so fast, it hasn't produced enough wood fiber to support itself. Your newly planted trees, whether they're balled and burlapped or containerized, need to grow new roots. So they need a high carbon nitrogen ratio. So if you add fertilizer, you're going to lower that, and it's going to focus on growing canopy instead of growing roots. The other thing you find in fertilizer is phosphorus. And what we find is when we have high phosphorus levels in our soils, that reduces iron uptake, which causes chlorosis. That means the tree is having a hard time making chlorophyll, which is obviously a bad thing, and they start turning yellow because chlorine has a yellow color. That's where we get the name. We also see that high phosphorus reduces the formation of ectomycorrhizae. And ectomycorrhizae are those fungal root symbiotic relationships that provide water and nutrients to the plant and are very important to the plant. Therefore, or ergo, don't fertilize your new trees. Goes along with that, nothing goes in the hole but the soil that came out and water and the plant. Couple of last items. You do need to manage expectations if you are going to be doing this in your front yard where everybody can see it. And signs are a great way to do that. We have certified our habitat with everybody we can think of that will give us a sign to put up in the front yard. We started off with just some signs we made ourselves. We took them to Kinko's as a PowerPoint slide and had them printed out on vinyl, and we made stands for them. Sometimes you can make your own custom signs. And unfortunately, I've lost the name of the company that did this. One of the great things about my wife is this was one of her best Christmas presents. I gave her 15 of these signs to put on plants in our yard. So that's managing those expectations so your neighbors don't think you're a kook, don't think you're a slob, that you really have a purpose that's recognized by other people as being valuable for the ecosystem. This is a plea from me. If you are planting, go to this website and register or report all of the trees you plant, trees and shrubs that you plant. Virginia has committed to planting a gazillion urban trees. Actually, the number is closer to 9 million trees for Chesapeake Bay water quality. And we've got to count them somehow. That's what my agency has to do, is count them. And this is one of the ways we have doing it. Finally, just to bring us back to the beginning of the webinar series, I don't think Doug Colomay talked about this, but you can also register your new native plant habitat as part of the Homegrown National Park. We're trying to get 20 million acres of turf converted to native plants, and we're counting it 10 square feet at a time. So please go and register and become one of the partners. You can also get a sign for your yard that says, this is what we're doing. We're part of a movement. So that's all I had to say. I went a little over, sorry, Virginia. But this is my contact information. And now I will start answering questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. Man, when you started talking about mulching, the questions were just like hot and heavy. So I'll start with one of those, and then we'll let Margaret take over the rest of them. Yeah, so let's. I love this one, which is there any truth to the I guess rumor that ticks are prevalent in wood chip mulch?
No.
Well, that was an easy one.
Ticks quest by climbing vegetation. There may be some ticks in your mulch, but there may also be mosquitoes in your mulch or any number of other things, especially if you're getting it from in bulk from where there's just a big pile. But for the most part, it's not really good habitat. First of all, The ticks that most people are concerned about, the black-legged ticks, hate the sun. You take black-legged ticks, put them out in a field, and they are going to get back into the woods as fast as they can. So no, I wouldn't worry about ticks coming with your mulch.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Right, as Ann said, there's an unbelievable number of questions about wood chips, but let's leave that subject briefly and talk about some other things. This one is of great interest to many people, but very different topic, which is land use policies. So the question was, we're looking at possible zoning changes in our county. Any ideas for zoning provisions that ensure that redevelopment doesn't eliminate all green space in which trees can be planted?
That is a tough question in Virginia, because the state puts certain restrictions on what you can and cannot require under your zoning codes. I do know that most, especially residential zoning, does require a certain amount of open space. Now, one of the ways, if you are currently in Northern Virginia, outside of Fairfax County, so if you're in Loudoun, Prince William, Arlington, Alexandria, or any of the cities therein, you do have recourse to State Code 15.2-961.1, which sets canopy requirements, but also requires that those canopy requirements be met in part by tree preservation. 15.2-961, which is available throughout the rest of the state, at least within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. All communities can use it. Outside the watershed, it may still be restricted to communities that have more than 75 people per square mile. You can set canopy requirements, but it can only, those canopy requirements can be met either by planting or by tree preservation. So you can't require tree preservation under 961. And I will say this, since we have a statewide audience, there are only 19 communities in the entire state that use that authority from the state legislature, either as 961 and 961.1. Fairfax County is the only one that uses 961.1, so they can require tree preservation even in by right developments.
Oh, that's a complicated subject.
Yes, the other way you can protect tree canopy is through cluster development, which allows you to put all the density on one part of the site and then save the rest of the site.
Hmm.
But there should be a very tough conservation easement on that save area.
All right, thanks. All right, so another total change of subject here. Looking at your front yard with as many plants, does it meet the requirements of being fire-wise? Those plantings look very close to the building.
Those plantings look very close to the building, but none of them are particularly flammable. So with fire-wise, you want to make sure you're not planting really flammable stuff right up next to your building. You also want to make sure you don't have mulch that goes right up to the building. So in Virginia, what we're looking at, and one of the nice things about the latest edition of the Common Native Trees of Virginia is they give fire-wise rating for all the plants. And it's pretty much just the conifers in terms of the trees. I also would not plant rhododendrons or mountain laurel right next to my house. Those things, the mountain laurel particularly, burns like gasoline. When we get into a fire situation and the fire gets into mountain laurel, we go to the other side of the mountain laurel and fight it there. We do not try and fight fire in mountain laurel. But keep in mind, Firewise is a nationwide program from the U.S. Forest Service, and it's a one-size-fits-all program. And our vegetation, particularly deciduous vegetation, is very different from what you find, for example, in the on the West Coast, where you have those Mediterranean climates.
Okay. Well, all right, so there is the common theme here that they're evergreen, I mean, or have you just listed the only things we need to worry about, and other ways we don't need to worry about it?
We don't have to worry as much about the live deciduous plants. For the most part, you can't set those things on fire with a flamethrower. There's just too much water in them. And that's part of the evolutionary differences. The dicots, which are all the flowering plants that we usually think about, things like oaks and those shrubs and everything, use water-based chemicals for defense, whereas the conifers that evolved 150 years earlier, when Pangea was just forming on the continental, in that continental climate, tend to use more oil-based things. So they are much more flammable than our hardwoods.
Well, now people really love to use evergreens as foundation plants.
Well, and they are usually surrounded by turf, which is a really good firewise plant. Because even if you do get your thatch catching on fire, that's something you can go out there and stomp out with your feet or deal with your hose. The fire is not likely to get to those evergreens. But in firewise communities, they don't use evergreens. They don't use the conifers for foundation plants.
Okay. All right, so this was a very brief question, but an important one. The rooftop solar dilemma.
Yes. It is a problem. In general, from solar advocates that I've talked to, even some solar panel companies, in fact, we even considered putting solar panels on our roof when we did our renovation. And the guy from the company came out and he looked at it without me even telling him that cutting down that maple tree was a non-starter. He said that tree is doing more for you in terms of electric efficiency than the solar panels would. And he recommended against it. So a lot of these companies are recognizing we don't want to be cutting down trees just for the sake of putting up solar panels. I keep asking them to focus on tuning those things so they have their greatest efficiency with green light, because that's what gets through the canopy, and then we don't have that conflict anymore. Then there's the issue with the commercial solar panel farms. And to a certain extent, that has been, I know there have been some cases up here around DC. And there is, for example, there was a big controversy in Arlington because they were going to buy all their solar power from a farm that was proposed in Pittsylvania County on a tree farm. Well, it turns out the tree farm was on an old tobacco farm. And I talked with the forester down there and he said, yeah, those things are never going to be really trees. It was a really bad site for plants because the tobacco had really depleted the site. So you got to kind of do your research and pick and choose there.
Okay.
But I would not cut down a tree in order to put up solar panels. I don't think that the trade-off is worth it.
All right. That's helpful. It's an economic argument as well as an ecosystem argument.
Yes.
That's very helpful. Okay, so you had mentioned the viburnum. I think you had mentioned black haw, but the question is, if you were only to plant one viburnum, what's your favorite?
I think my favorite is maple leaf viburnum. It gets really great fall color, almost. And thank you for wearing that sweater tonight, because that's about the fall, about the color of maple leaf viburnum in the fall.
Yeah, that's very pretty. Okay, and someone wants to know what your favorite trees are to plant.
My favorite trees to plant are loblolly pines, largely because they're really easy to plant. In terms of my favorite trees, I really like Nyssa sylvatica. It's got a lot of really good qualities. Part of it is because we had a big one in our backyard that had a big rotted space at the bottom, and my dad did something that I now know was exactly the wrong thing to do. He put concrete over the rot, and that just made things worse. And I watched it fall during a thunderstorm one July. which was really cool. And then since it turned out it was on county property, they came and cut it up into sections. Now, keep in mind, this was back in the 70s. I don't think they still do that. And I tried to split it, and you can't split it at all. But I just think it's a really nice plant. It's got great fall color. And it's a good bee plant. It's a good bird plant as well. It's got ecological value too. And it's one of the few very shade tolerant species we have that's also very fire tolerant.
How fast does it grow in the shade?
In the shade, it grows at, one study put the average growth diameter at 2 millimeters, or no, 0.2 millimeters a year. And then when you release it and it's growing in the sun, diameter growth jumped to a whopping 2 millimeters a year. It's a slow growing tree. And it has no economic value. So it was used as witness tree by George Washington and the other colonial surveyors, because they knew nobody was going to cut that tree down.
Oh, fascinating. All right, someone wants to know what trees you would plant on a parking lot island, and commented that the sourwoods didn't make it even with irrigation.
So parking lot islands, these are generally like 2 parking spaces that have been, they put a curb around, they threw all the garbage from building the parking lot in there, then they dump some mediocre soil on top and compacted the heck out of it, and then they expected trees to grow there. It gets back to that's what I said about room for the roots. And pretty much with parking lot islands, you can grow a small species there, or you can grow a big species there. Just don't expect them to live more than about 20 years, 20 to 30 years. They're going to exhaust the resources there, and they're going to start to decline and die. And it doesn't really matter what species. Probably the best species to plant there would be Quercus aluminicanus, which I can see you're not familiar with. That's an aluminum oak tree.
Oh, very funny. Okay, thanks for that.
Arborists call those parking lot islands tree coffins, by the way.
Yeah, that's sad. All righty. Okay, let's see. Question about understory trees, which is, can you plant them under a canopy tree that's already there?
Yes, but like I said, plant a small specimen so you don't disturb the roots of that canopy tree. It's also a good idea to be out closer to the drip line. Even things like redbuds and dogwoods, which are shade tolerant, are going to grow a little better if they get a little more sun. So that redbud I have is getting morning sun, and then it's shaded in the afternoon by that big maple. And then the dogwood, it's doing less and less well because it's getting more and more shaded by that big pin oak. But it gets some afternoon sun, but it's got more shade. But they do better under the shade. And by the way, dogwoods do miserably when you plant them out in full sun. So they want some shade. You want to plant that under a bigger tree, or say on the east or north side of your house.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned that it may take 2-3 years for a tree to become established. How do you know when it's established?
You'll probably notice a jump in the canopy growth. So there are 2 different things. One is, at least commercially, they almost always stake trees. And the arborists have been fighting against that, because once people put that, once they put the stake and the guy on, everybody's afraid to take that off. But those guys should not be on for more than 6 months. That's why I prefer, or excuse me, they should not be on for more than 1 year. That's why I prefer to use, if you're going to put a guy on a tree, the best thing to use is cotton fabric. So take a t-shirt, cotton t-shirt, and tear it up into strips and make your guide from that. And the reason that's a good thing to use is it will rot before it girdles the tree. So you want to, as soon as the tree is firm in the ground, and you use the wiggle test, which is you grab hold of up near the top and you shake it back and forth. And if the ground is moving as you shake it, that's generally an indication it has not, gotten out of the hole and established itself. And so you leave it on. But after a year, if it still fails the wiggle test, you probably want to take it up and replant it. For telling when it's established, in terms of that, you just need to go by that guideline of 1 year per inch caliper. And then you should start seeing more growth in the canopy, because during that establishment period, it's putting most of its growth, or it should be putting most of its growth, into roots.
Okay. And what about the green bags people use for watering? What do you think of those, and when should they be removed? And I found that some are on so long they're strangling the tree, and mold is
Yes,
the problem.
so that's another thing that, they put them on and then nobody knows what to do with them. So those are irrigation devices, and they can be useful as long as they are filled every week, because you put 25 gallons, typically in a single bag will hold 25 gallons. It will be slow released over time, but by the end of the week, it's empty and it needs to be refilled. Once the tree is established, those things should come off, and then they can be reused on another planting. Once you stop, if you say, I'm tired of putting water in this thing, take it off the tree. Otherwise, it can strangle the tree. It's also really good habitat for social wasps, which are the ones that sting.
Ouch. Okay. All right. So now we're getting to the 1,000 mulch questions. Get yourself ready. Okay. So someone said, I thought green wood chips pull nitrogen from the soil.
No.
Oh, there you are.
That is an extrapolation from green sawdust, which does create a measurable nitrogen draft. All mulch is going to pull a little bit of nitrogen from the soil, but green wood chips, all the experiments have shown there is not a measurable nitrogen draft associated with the green wood chips.
Okay, good. All right. So then we have, if you get wood chips from a tree company, how do you know if the trees they cut down weren't sick trees or trees harboring invasive insects?
That's a question you really need to ask, but generally, as far as the disease are concerned, the pathogens are not going to live long in those wood chips. One thing that people get confused about is there are wood decay fungi that will get into a living tree, and they are going after the dead wood in the center of the tree. They are not attacking the live wood in the outer edge of the tree, in the sapwood. There are some pathogenic fungi that attack the live wood, but they are not wood decay fungi. So once that tree is down and dead, those living pathogens that may attack your tree are also going to die, because they no longer have because mostly what they're feeding on there is the sap in the sapwood. And, those wood chips are not producing, they're not photosynthesizing, they're not producing them. In terms of the invasive insects, there are very few of them out there, and most of them are not going to survive a trip through the chipper. But you can ask, and definitely I wouldn't use ash for that, because the emerald ash borer will survive a single chip through or trip through the chipper. It won't survive the second one. That's what they've been doing, is they've been double chipping those trees. But that's really the only one I can think of. The gypsy moth are going to be in there as eggs, but not as larvae. The ambrosia beetles, the problem there is the fungi they carry, not the beetle themselves. So aside from the ash, I'm not too concerned about using those wood chips.
All right, so Someone asked about leaf mulch. How about that?
You know, I've thought a lot about leaf mulch. As long as it's not too deep. So if you've got leaf mulch and you want to put on a little bit, a couple of, maybe a quarter of an inch or so, that's probably not a problem. But leaf mulch has the same problem, can have the same problem as that finely graded or shredded mulch, in that it can lock together and it can create mats that create water and vapor barriers. I've mentioned vapor barriers. What I'm talking about is, like I said about the bald cypress, tree roots need oxygen, and so does a lot of the stuff, pretty much everything that's living in the soil. So if you put down a vapor barrier that keeps oxygen from going into the soil, pretty soon all the soil oxygen gets used up and things start to suffocate. And so if you've got your leaf mulch too deep, and this is why you don't want to blow your leaves into the forest repeatedly in the same place, because you're going to create those kinds of mats that are going to be bad for your soil. But a little bit of a layer, if you think about how many leaves come down in the course of the year, and if you grind those up, how thin that layer would be. You're talking about maybe an eighth or a quarter inch deep. That's deep enough. You go much deeper than that with the leaf mulch, you're probably going to be too deep.
Okay. Well, speaking of blowing leaves, you know, we've been telling everyone, leave the leaves. That's where the critters overwinter. So the question was essentially, why do you need mulch?
You don't need mulch if you've already got that. I don't put down mulch in my yard except on the paths. But you do need to have some woody debris. So what comes down with those leaves are also sticks and other branches, and you need to leave that stuff as well, because that's for your soils. But not raking your leaves is a great way to improve your soil. When we moved into our house, we had no A horizon. I now have 2 inches of A horizon because it's got 20 years worth of leaf fall. And anybody who's doing the math might go, well, you haven't lived there 20 years, and that's right. But the first 3 years, we had our neighbors blow their leaves into our yard when we still had turf. And by the way, speaking of turf, if you go on Scott's, the lawn care company's website, they will tell you not to rake your leaves, just to mulch them in place.
Right. So let me try and clarify this in my own mind. Are you saying that when you're planting a tree in your yard, you wouldn't need to mulch, but when people are planting a lawn, they need to?
Yeah. When I'm planting in my yard, what I do is I scrape away the leaf litter and all that stuff, the natural mulch that's been placed there. I dig the hole, put the plant in the ground, and I push that stuff back, or I use some of that handcrafted mulch that we have.
Okay. All right, now if you do use mulch, someone says if you're putting down 12 inches wood chips, when can you start? When and how would you plant native ground covers?
There you would be, it would be, when you're talking about ground covers like those, the pussy toes and the strawberries, that would be hard to do through those 12 inches of wood chips. But when you're talking about ground cover in terms of things like uvularia or some of the Solomon seals or woodland, I'm trying to think of some of the other stuff we have in our yard. We've got woodland, goldenrod, and a bunch of other things that are taller. You can plant through those 12 inches of wood chips. Now, what you do is you put down the wood chips and come back in 6 months and start planting. And in that time, there will be a little bit of settling and decomposition. But you can just plant right straight through those things.
Okay. All right. We're away from mulch questions for at least for a while. All right. So this is, are there trees that don't like their roots disturbed when planted? There's all this root ball cutting being done during dormancy. kind of two questions there.
Well, like I said, most of the roots that I cut off were those absorbing roots that the tree is constantly growing and shedding, so that's not a problem. And for roots, there is a rule of thumb that I am willing to quote, which is if the root is smaller than your thumb, it's going to resprout very quickly after being cut. I don't use the other rule of thumb because that has to do with feeding the wife. No, that wasn't necessarily dormant season that I was doing that. And you don't have to prune during dormant season. The only restriction on when you would prune the canopy is if there is a pathogen like oak wilt that is present at certain times that would be attracted to those pruning cuts. And we do not have oak wilt in Virginia.
Okay, very good. Someone said, I use cloth pot to establish shrub root systems. Is this better than plastic pots?
If by cloth pot, she's talking about like the weed fabric pots, yes, that's actually, the industry is going in that direction, using those cloth pots instead of plastic pots, because there you can get natural root pruning. So what'll happen is the root will start growing out and it gets in between the fibers there, and as it expands, it gets pruned off naturally. And sometimes they're using them above ground and they start growing out, they hit the air and that prunes them. And we wind up with much better root systems from those container grown trees with those cloth pots than we do with the plastic pots.
All right, well, that's a little bit related to the next question, which is about planting acorns. So I guess you want a cloth pot if you could get it, but the question was how to tell if acorns are viable. Put them in water or eyeball them, or how do you tell?
So the way that they tell down at the nursery, and this would require, I should have looked this up, but I know what they do is they put the acorn, they half fill a 55-gallon drum with the acorns, and then they fill it the rest of the way with water. And I'm pretty sure the ones that float are the bad ones, so they get skimmed off and fed to the pigs. And the ones that sink go out into the nursery. But I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay. Do you recommend using tree tubes to protect against deer?
I do. The Department of Forestry has done some research, and we actually get better growth with the tree, with the tree tubes. And I will qualify that. The tree tubes that you buy that are already circles and have the laser etched lines work very well in not only promoting tree growth or protecting the tree from deer. You can also get them a few inches into the ground, so they'll protect them from voles, and we get better tree growth in those than we do even in wire cages. And of course, in the experiment, we couldn't tell how much better it was than no protection at all, because the unprotected trees all got eaten. So it's, you know, kind of hard to do your experiment with when your control gets consumed by the deer. But I do recommend those. Now, I know if you don't want to have that in your yard, you can go with more of a wire cage, but you really do, in most suburban settings, you really do need to protect from deer, because the only native woody plant that I am absolutely 100% sure is deer proof is pawpaw.
Well,
That's not a terribly good pollinator plant.
I did a planting where someone, whoever was in charge, gave us those tree tubes that are kind of like a mesh with holes in it. And I was just wondering if what that would do. It seems like the branches would grow right out through the holes.
That's a possibility. But the other problem that I've had with those, with the mesh tubes or the holes, is that you can't get them into the ground. When you push on them, they just fold in half.
Yeah.
So, and the ones that come flat and you put the slot in the tab, or the tab in the slot, those things they untab immediately. Also 4 foot or more for deer protection.
Okay. Then I remember being told that you should put something on the top to keep the birds from flying down.
There are bird nets that usually come with the tubes. It's important that you get those down. If you look at the manufacturer's suggestion, it leaves them sort of like with this bunty little stocking cap on the top. What we found is as the leader comes up through those things, they get all twisted and messed up. So you need to pull them down until you've got a hole about the size of a 50-cent piece in the top. That'll give you the protection for the birds, but it also creates a spot where the leader can come up without being damaged.
Oh, okay. I am planning to convert my front yard, which is 50 by 30 feet, from grass to a natural habitat area, but I have a mature 50-foot tulip poplar sharing this area, and I'm concerned about harming the root system when adding mulch to kill the grass.
So remember what I said, 12 inches of wood chips, you're not going to create a vapor or water barrier. And that's all that the tree is interested in. They want to make sure the water gets down through it and the oxygen gets down to the roots. So you're not going to hurt the root system with that. If you're using finely shredded mulch, yeah, that's going to hurt the root system of the tree, but it's also going to hurt it even if you didn't have grass that it were killing. So, you know, and if you're worried about going 12 inches deep, go 8 inches deep. But what they found was as the grass and the other stuff tries to grow up through it, it's using so much energy to grow that it's exhausting its resources before it comes out of the top of that. So it's not getting up to where it can photosynthesize and make more energy. And that's particularly true when you've got the, you're starting from seeds.
Alrighty. Can 3 white oaks be planted closer together deliberately so they can communicate rather than the specified distance?
Sure, nature plants, you know, will plant trees sometimes very close together. I don't know about the communication because, as I said, those root systems reach out pretty far. And the other thing that the mycorrhizae is doing is you'll get one fungi that's attached to all 3 and it's sharing information through those fungi. So distance is not, I mean, obviously there is such a thing as too far apart. A white oak in Fairfax County is not communicating with a white oak in Lee County, but within shouting distance of each other, they're, you know, even if you plant them on 15 or 20-foot centers. The problem you may run into, though, if you plant them really close together, is they will wind up competing with each other, or you wind up with 3 trees that have all their growth on one side of the tree, so they're unbalanced. And that's not really all that big an issue for you, but your grandkids may not appreciate that because you created a hazard for them.
But I thought when you planted them close together, their roots would interlock and they'd hold each other up.
Even if their roots interlock and they hold each other up, when all the weight is on one side of the tree, it's still going to go over. And I've seen that. That's one of the problems we see is, for example, I take the Master Naturalist. I'm the chapter advisor, but I also teach the forest ecology classes for the Master Naturalist in Fairfax County. And I take them out on a hike, and there was what were essentially 2 hickories, big nut hickories that were probably 30 inches in diameter, growing side by side. They probably started out as sprouts off of the same stump. Even though they were growing possibly on the same root system, because they were so close together, all of their weight was on the outside of those trees, and eventually they split in 2 and are now lying on the ground.
So what is the minimum distance you would recommend planting trees?
And that's one of the things. I'm getting a real bad buzz. Are you?
Not from this end.
Oh, okay. That's one of the things that I see, you know, in the landscape. People I guess people think they look pretty is those river birches that are planted with 3 or 4 stems all together. Well, I've seen a lot of those that have grown up and are now 18, 20-inch diameter trees, and they're all cable because they're growing so close together, they are falling away from each other.
Well, how far should trees be planted from each other at a minimum?
A canopy tree, an oak like that, I would not plant them more than 15 feet on center. Probably further apart.
Okay.
It depends on how long you think those trees are going to be there. Especially if you're in like in Fairfax County, we're seeing a lot of redevelopment. So a lot of the trees that were planted back in the 40s and 50s when these small houses were being built are coming down to make room for bigger houses. So it depends on your landscape. So, even though those trees can live 150, 200 years, development pressures and human society may not let them last that long.
Tell us about the dogwood disease, the
Discula destructiva. Dogwood anthracnose is something we think came in with the Korean dogwoods. It is fairly fatal on for most trees in most landscape settings. What we see is it's worse on trees that are planted where there's more stress. So particularly up higher on the ridge where you have drier, less fertile soils, they tend to be more susceptible, but also ones down closer to the stream where you have deeper, richer soils, but they're also much more subject to saturation. And so you have low oxygen conditions. So the ones in the mid slope are the ones that tend to do the best. In terms of the commercial trade, there is Appalachian Spring and a couple of other cultivars. And this is, again, gets into that whole issue of some of these things are not too messed around with. Appalachian Spring is simply trees that were produced vegetatively from a small group of dogwoods that survived an anthracnose outbreak on Catoctin Mountain. And so then they started producing them, so they had a natural resistance. But when you start looking at those resistance, you'll see in a lot of them, the scientific name, there's an X, which means they're a cross between Cornus florida and Cornus cusa, which is Korean dogwood. And I'd stay away from them. But also things you can do if you've already got a tree in the ground, it starts in the leaves and works into the trunk. So dogwoods tend to have little suckers coming off the trunk. If you prune those off, don't let the foliage get wet. So if you're irrigating, use drip irrigation, don't use a sprinkler system. Those two things, and also thin them out a little bit so you get better airflow so they dry out quicker, because it is a leaf fungus and you want dry conditions in the canopy for it.
Well, I think it may have been you who said that, or perhaps it was someone else, that the existence of this fungus is not a reason not to plant dogwoods, it's a reason to plant more of them.
It wasn't me.
Okay.
But certainly I would say I would not shy away from the dogwoods just because of dogwood anthrax. Like I said, if you go into the commercial trade, almost all of them have resistance, either like with the Appalachian Spring, and then there are some that have derived from that, from natural resistance. There are also those crossbreed cultivars that are resistant, but certainly plant the dogwoods. They not only, one of the things they didn't talk about is that the leaf litter of dogwood is 3% calcium by dry weight. So they're also really important for our birds, because what's happening is our land snails are feeding on those dogwood leaves, and then the birds are feeding on the land snails to get the calcium they need to make their eggs. And before you feed baby birds, you have to have eggshells that will stand up to being incubated.
Oh,
And
Well,
dog.
good reason.
That's another reason we're seeing a decrease in bird populations.
Ooh. Because there are not enough dogwoods.
Because there are not enough calcium pumps. Dogwood is not the only calcium pump, but it's the one that I know about specifically. There are other plants out there that do that as well.
Okay. All right, another mulch question. What do you think about pine needle mulch?
Pine needle mulch is great for pine trees. That's what nature uses to mulch the pine trees. So yeah. And if you want to use it around your heaths, they also, they tend to grow. There are places where they'll grow well together. But again, you don't want to get that too deep because you'll get that matting. And what will also happen is if it's really deep, you'll start to get the decay fungi working in above the ground level, and then it becomes more of an umbrella than something that's helping water sink in.
Okay. All righty. I lost 4 chestnut oaks in Fairfax this year. Is there a systematic problem with the species here?
No. What's happening is something called oak decline syndrome. Basically what it is I prefer to call it multiple stress disorder. But what happens is it starts with usually a drought, but it could also be a flood or unusually wet weather, a defoliation event, some sort of an environmental factor that stresses the tree. And before it recovers from that, it gets hit with another stressor and then another stressor and then another stressor. Meanwhile, the tree is slowly spiraling into death. And then all of a sudden, you notice it's not healthy and it dies. We lost a lot of oaks statewide in 2019 when we got a 10,000-year storm on July 8th, and then it didn't rain again until September. And they did some studies of some black oaks that died out at the Smithsonian Research Center there in Front Royal, and they found those trees had been in decline for 10 years. So what started it was back in 2013 and 14, we had 2 summers where we had very hot, dry weather. And that started them on that pathway. And then finally something comes along and they just can't take it. But we don't have any kind of a disease or insect problem that is endemic.
Well, there's certain oaks that tend to be less stressed, better choices.
If you have, especially the ones that are dying now, are usually remnants, and chestnut oak grows, its most prominent place is it grows up on ridge lines in monocultures because it is the best adapted to dry and fertile sites, at least from the Piedmont West. And so if it's dominated, if it's in your landscape, it's because it already was growing in precarious positions on really crappy sites. When you get into the white oaks, and the white oaks tend to be also very susceptible to this decline because they're next in line after the chestnut oak. So they grow on the slightly better sites where they can push out the chestnut oaks. And then you start getting into your red oaks and black oaks, and they tend to grow on slightly better sites, so they are a little less susceptible. But okay. It's all got to do with that. They start off in a bad position and it gets worse.
So am I hearing that you're suggesting red oaks might be a safer bet?
No, plant the white oaks, plant the chestnut oaks. Those are good trees. Because you got to put it in context. These trees that are dying are 75 to 100 years old. So we've already gotten 75 to 100 years worth of good value out of them. So let's plant some more so that we get those values for the next 75 to 100 years. In terms of interactions between wildlife and a particular species of oaks, white oaks are probably the best. Their acorns are sweeter than some of the other acorns, and they're smaller, So there are more birds that can feed on them, more wildlife that's going to use that. There are a lot of things that won't eat a chestnut oak acorn because they're too big.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you. Well, we've run out of time.
I was going to
Sorry
say,
to
maybe
say,
just one
really.
more.
One more. Well, if you're up to it, there've just been several questions about heavily compacted soil, if you had any other advice on that topic.
Heavily compacted soil is really difficult to deal with, except in new construction. So if you're buying a brand new house, before you plant anything, what I recommend is, first of all, you take up that nasty sod that they put down, because it's probably going to die anyway because they put it down in July. Cover the ground with 6 inches of compost, rent a backhoe, and then scoop it up and dump it. So you're incorporating that compost into it. If any of you have nothing to do tomorrow, you can come to Waynesboro and see a demonstration of this. Also, if you have questions about trees, I'm going to be at Waynesboro tomorrow for that. But this has been demonstrated. Susan Day started this work down at Virginia Tech, and I think she's continuing it now that she's moved on to British Columbia, as probably the best method of dealing with soil compaction. But obviously, you got to do that before you have trees in the ground. Once you get trees in the ground, then it becomes a different process. And some of the arboricultural companies, the bigger ones, will do some root invigoration, they call it, but essentially it's soil decompaction, where they're coming in with what's called an air spade. So this is high pressure air that is traveling at supersonic speeds that they can kind of fluff up the soil, and then they can mix biochar or some other things in with it that are going to help keep it from recompacting. But it's a really inexpensive process to deal with on, if you want it dealt with in the short term. In the long term, the best thing to do is put lots of organic matter down, like don't rake your leaves for 17 years, and that can help start breaking up that compaction. If you're talking about farming and vegetable gardening, one of the good things to use they've found are, I call them actually, they're daikon radishes, but they call them conservation radishes because they use them in no-till agriculture, and they'll plant them out as a cover crop, and they will get down and start breaking up the hardpan under the crop fields.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Not a problem.
Yeah, Jim, thank you so much. I've learned so much. I've taken like 15 pages of notes while you were talking. So,
okay.
That was excellent. So Virginia's going to put up our slide we want to make sure that you guys get the date and the title for our next webinar. It's going to be on Tuesday evening, October 12th at 6:15. Our speaker is Kim Ehrman of Eco Beneficial. And Kim will tell us a little bit about how you can plan your native garden to make it look beautiful in all seasons. So be sure that you put that on your calendar and join us then. So again, that's October 12th. So thank you very much, everybody. It's good that we had so many folks. And Jim, thanks again for a really wonderful educational webinar. So much to learn.
You're welcome. There is a lot to learn.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
And if you can, I'm willing to stay and answer questions later for a longer period of time. It's all up to Margaret and Virginia.
Yes. Thank you so
Virginia, we're not
much,
getting... Sorry, Virginia. They ended it. Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Was really amazing.
Yeah, Jim, you sounded like you were about ready to lose your voice anyway. So
yeah.
Sorry about that.
And I don't have any place to be until 8 or 9 o'clock tomorrow. It's just doing half-hour drive to. Wayne.
Yeah.
All
Or we
right.
can cut and paste the rest of these questions.
Well,
into
Jim,
the
what we,
Google.
yeah. Yeah, what we'll do, Jim, is if you can help us with, we have a number of questions that of course we couldn't get to. So we'll be looking to you for some help in answering those questions as we put together some FAQs of to answer so many of the questions we've gotten over the series that we've heard repeatedly.
Okay,
So thank
happy
you.
to help. All right,
Yes, thank you ever so
you.
much.
you're welcome. Was it
Good night, everyone.
inspirational enough, Virginia?
Absolutely. Very, very informative. I need to go back and listen to the recording myself.
Yeah, it's
You
hard
answered
to
a lot of questions
listen
I
at the
had.
same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are tree stewards in Arlington that have come back to my classes 6 or 7 times because they keep learning new stuff.
Oh,
Of
yeah,
course, it doesn't hurt that I'm learning new stuff all the time.
exactly.
We are all, yeah,
You're
we're
always
all
up to
always
date.
learning.
Gotta go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good
All right.
night.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and hit end. Good night.
Good night.